When a billionaire knocked on a broke rancher's door in the middle of a storm, neither of them expected to lose their hearts along with everything else. If you're watching this right now, stay until the end, because this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The storm came in fast that Tuesday, the way bad things always did in Nebraska, without warning and without mercy. Logan Hayes had been out in it for 40 minutes already, wrestling a section of fence wire that had snapped clean off its post sometime around noon. The rain came sideways. His boots were soaked through. His jacket, the old canvas Carhartt he'd had since his early 20s, was doing nothing anymore, just holding cold water against his skin. He kept working anyway because the fence wasn't going to fix itself, and because standing still gave him too much time to think about the certified letter sitting on the kitchen counter back inside. He'd read it 3 times that morning. Final notice of default. Foreclosure proceedings will commence in 30 days unless outstanding balance of $214,400 is remitted in full. $214,000? He might as well have owed the moon. Logan drove the last staple into the post with 2 hard swings, yanked the wire tight, and stood back to look at his work. It would hold for a while. Maybe. Everything on this ranch held for a while. Maybe. That was the best he could say about any of it lately. He gathered his tools and started walking back toward the house. The ranch, what his grandfather had named Clearwater, though the creek it was named for had run low 3 summers running, spread out around him in the last gray light of evening. 42 acres. A barn that needed a new roof. A chicken coop that leaned slightly east. A bunkhouse nobody had slept in for 4 years. And the main house, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that smelled like coffee, and whatever Sophie had gotten into after school. Sophie. That was the part that kept him up at night. Not the debt, not the bank, not the creeping feeling that the whole thing was slipping through his fingers the way sand slips from a closed fist no matter how hard you squeeze. It was the thought of his daughter watching him fail. She was 6 years old. She still believed he could fix anything. He came through the back door and pulled off his boots in the mudroom, hung his soaking jacket on a hook that had been there since before he was born. Daddy! Sophie was at the kitchen table with a coloring book open in front of her, a box of crayons spread across half the surface, and a cup of apple juice that was dangerously close to the edge. She was wearing her yellow pajamas, the ones with the little ducks on them, even though it was barely 6:30. Hey, Bug. He crossed to her and kissed the top of her head. Her hair smelled like the strawberry shampoo she loved. You get yourself ready for bed already? I was cold. She held up her drawing without looking away from it. Look what I made. He looked. It was a house, clearly the farmhouse with its distinctive crooked chimney, surrounded by what he guessed were flowers, though they could have been explosions. There were 3 stick figures out front, a tall one, a small one, and a taller one in what appeared to be a dress. Who's the tall one in the dress? He asked. Sophie shrugged, coloring carefully. I don't know. She lives here. Logan looked at the drawing for another moment. Then he went to the stove and started heating up the chili he'd left in the pot from 2 days ago. They ate together the way they always did, at the small table with the window that faced west, where the sky was still throwing lightning around in the distance. Sophie talked about what happened at school. Something about a boy named Marcus, who'd eaten a crayon on a dare, and a substitute teacher who didn't know the rules about bathroom breaks. Logan listened and asked the right questions and tried not to look at the letter on the counter. After she was in bed, after the story, the glass of water, the confirmation that the closet was not, in fact, harboring anything, he sat at the kitchen table alone and spread out the financial documents for what felt like the 100th time. The numbers didn't get better with looking at them. They never did. He'd taken out the second loan 3 years ago, when the equipment failure had wiped out most of his winter income. He'd planned to pay it back in 2 years. Then came the drought. Then the market prices dropped. Then his truck needed a new engine. The loan had grown like something alive, feeding on interest, growing heavier and more impossible with every season. His neighbor Dale Hutchins had sold his farm last year. 60 acres of Hutchins land, his family's land going back 4 generations, gone to some investment group out of Chicago that Logan had never heard of. Midland Horizon Holdings, they called themselves. 3 other farms in Holt County had gone the same way in the past 18 months, all bought by the same company for prices that sounded good, until you realized the land was being consolidated and none of those families were farming it anymore. Logan had been approached twice. Both times he'd said no. Both times the representative, a young guy in a clean shirt who clearly hadn't spent much time outdoors, had smiled like he expected Logan to change his mind eventually. He wasn't going to change his mind. But the bank didn't care about his principles. He was still sitting there at 10 o'clock when he heard it, the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. He frowned. Nobody came out this way at 10 o'clock on a stormy Tuesday. He stood up and looked out the window over the sink. Through the rain-blurred glass, he could see headlights. Not a truck. Something bigger, lower. The headlights had that particular brightness that expensive vehicles had. LED, sharp-edged, almost aggressive. A luxury SUV sat in his driveway. Black. No plates he recognized. Logan pulled on a dry jacket and went to the front door, opening it before whoever it was could knock. The woman on his porch was not what he expected. She was maybe 30, 31. Dark hair pulled back in a way that had probably been neat 12 hours ago and wasn't anymore. She was wearing a coat that cost more than his truck payment, but it was soaked through, and her shoes, heels, actual heels, were covered in mud from crossing the yard. She had a phone in one hand and a leather portfolio under her arm, and she was looking at him with an expression that was trying hard to be composed and not quite making it. Behind her, still in the SUV, Logan could see the shape of someone in the driver's seat. "Logan Hayes?" she said. "That's me." "My name is Victoria Langford." She said it the way people said names that were supposed to mean something. "I need to speak with you." He looked at her. He looked at the rain coming down behind her. He looked at the mud on her shoes. "Come in," he said, "before you drown." She stood in his kitchen and didn't sit down right away, even when he pulled out a chair. She looked around the room, not rudely, exactly, but with the focused attention of someone cataloging things. Her eyes moved to the bills stacked near the coffee maker, the cracked linoleum near the back door, the old photograph on the wall of his grandparents standing in front of this same house in what looked like 1962. Logan put the kettle on. "You want to tell me what this is about?" he asked. "It's late. I've got a kid sleeping in the next room." Victoria set her portfolio on the table carefully so it didn't knock anything over, and finally sat down. Up close, he could see she was tired. Not just tonight, tired, but the deep kind, the kind that settles into a person's face and stays there. "I know what time it is," she said. "I know this is unusual. I wouldn't be here if I had any other option." That's a sentence people say before they ask for something big. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. "Your bank holds a note on this property. $214,000, due in 30 days. Logan went very still. "How do you know that?" "Because I own a majority share in Consolidated Prairie Bank," she said, "and your file crossed my desk 6 weeks ago." She held up a hand before he could respond to that. "I'm not here as a creditor. I want to be clear about that. What I'm about to propose is entirely separate from the bank's processes." "What are you proposing?" Victoria opened the portfolio and slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward him. He didn't pick it up. He kept his eyes on her face. "I need a husband," she said, "for 1 year. A legal marriage, documented, visible. Public appearances, a shared address, the full arrangement. At the end of 12 months, we divorce quietly. You receive enough money to pay off this ranch completely. The bank note, all outstanding debts, plus a full operational fund to keep this place running for the next 5 years. The kettle began to whistle. Logan took it off the burner. He stood with his back to her for a moment, staring at the dark window above the sink. "Why?" he said. "That's a complicated answer." "Then start talking." He heard her shift in the chair. He turned around and leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Langford Industries," she said. "My family's company. Agricultural supply chain, equipment manufacturing, infrastructure. My father built it over 30 years. He died 14 months ago, and the majority of the company passed to me." She paused. "There is a man named Garrett Hale. He runs an investment group, Midland Horizon Holdings." Logan felt something move through him, cold and distinct. who has spent the last year quietly accumulating shares in Langford Industries through proxy companies. In 6 weeks, there will be a shareholder vote. If he reaches majority control, he takes the company. Her voice stayed flat. Garrett Hale does not make things. He dismantles them. He'll strip the company's assets, sell off the divisions, and use the capital to expand his land consolidation operation. Midland Horizon, Logan said. That's him? Yes. He's been buying farms in this county. 3 last year. He made an offer on my land twice. He's been buying farms across 12 counties, Victoria said. Small operations, family farms. He gets them cheap when they're distressed, consolidates the land and leases it to industrial operators. She paused. He's very good at creating distress. Logan stared at her. Is that what you're doing? Creating distress? The question landed hard. He meant it to. Something in her eyes flickered, but not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. I had nothing to do with your bank note, she said. I want that to be absolutely clear, but I won't pretend I'm unaware of the leverage the situation provides. She looked at him steadily. I need someone credible, someone who doesn't come from my world. Garrett Hale has spent the last 6 months trying to paint me as an out-of-touch heiress who inherited a company she can't run. If I arrive at that shareholder vote with a husband, a real one, visible, documented, with roots in the agricultural communities my company serves, it changes the narrative. You need a prop. I need a partner, she said, and something in her voice shifted just slightly. There's a difference. Logan looked at the document on the table. He didn't touch it. I have a daughter, he said. She's 6 years old. She lives here. This isn't some setup I can just... I know about Sophie. Victoria said it quietly. I read your file. I'm not asking you to hide her or explain her away. The arrangement accounts for her. You're talking about turning her life upside down. I'm offering to make sure she still has a home. The words came out softer than she'd probably intended. She cleared her throat. I understand if the answer is no, but I needed you to hear the whole thing first. Logan was quiet for a long time. Outside, the rain kept coming. The old house made its familiar sounds. The pop and settle of the rafters, the faint whistle of wind through the kitchen window's imperfect seal. He'd grown up in these sounds. His father had grown up in these sounds. His grandfather had built the walls that made them. Tell me the full terms, he said finally. He hadn't said yes, but he hadn't said no. Victoria stayed for 2 hours. The coffee went from hot to warm to cold, and Logan made a fresh pot without asking. She was the kind of person who talked in specifics, numbers, timelines, conditions, contingencies, and he found himself following it more easily than he expected. She was smart, annoyingly smart. The kind of person who had clearly prepared for every possible objection and had a calm, reasoned response ready before he finished forming the sentence. The terms were these: a legal marriage, registered in Nebraska within the week. They would divide time between the ranch and her residence in Omaha. He would accompany her to corporate functions, public appearances, and the annual Langford Industries Leadership Conference in Denver in 8 weeks. She would attend community events in Holt County, appear as his wife in the context of his life here. No false affection required, I says. Only civil, believable behavior. At 12 months, an uncontested divorce. Logan would receive full payoff of the bank note, clearance of all remaining agricultural debt, and a fund of $300,000 for ranch operations. Sophie would not be displaced. Her school, her life, her routine, unchanged. Anytime Victoria was at the ranch would be on agreed terms. What happens if Hale finds out? Logan asked. He'll try to find out. He's already hired people to investigate me. That's partly why the timing matters. We need to be married and visible before his investigators have any reason to look closely. And if he makes it public? If he tells shareholders it's fake? He won't be able to prove it's fake if it isn't. She looked at him steadily. It will be a real marriage. Legal, documented, witnessed. What people choose to believe about the emotional content of a marriage is their own business. Logan sat with that for a moment. What do you want out of this? He asked. Personally, not the company. You. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She looked down at her coffee cup. To protect what my father built, she said. To keep Langford Industries intact so that it can keep doing what it does, supplying equipment and infrastructure to independent farmers who can't afford to lose a major distributor. She paused. And to make sure Garrett Hale does not win. That last one sounded a little personal. It is, she said, and didn't explain further. Logan stood up and walked to the window. The rain was easing. He could see the barn now, a dark shape against darker sky. He thought about the fence he'd fixed tonight. He thought about how many more fences needed fixing. He thought about Sophie's drawing, the 3 stick figures, the house, the woman in the dress who lived there. He thought about Dale Hutchins packing up his family's belongings and loading them into a truck while Logan watched from the road. One condition, he said, without turning around. Name it. Sophie doesn't get lied to, not in any way that matters. She's 6. She doesn't need to understand all of it. But I won't tell her something that's going to hurt her later. A pause. Agreed, Victoria said. I don't lie to children. He turned around. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something careful, and maybe surprised, like she'd expected him to ask for more money. One more thing, he said. Go ahead. You're going to track mud in and out of this house on a regular basis for the next year. You'll need different shoes. That got a reaction from her. Not quite a laugh. More like something that started to be one and thought better of it. She looked down at her ruined heels. I'll make a note, she said. Wow. The paperwork took 9 days. Victoria had lawyers, several of them, who moved with the kind of coordinated efficiency that comes from being paid extraordinary amounts of money. A prenuptial agreement, a private contract, a non-disclosure arrangement that ran to 37 pages and covered scenarios Logan hadn't imagined. He had his own lawyer review everything. His cousin Jerry, who primarily handled DUIs and estate matters in O'Neill, but was thorough enough to spend 2 days going through it all and declared it legitimate. You understand what you're signing, Jerry said, sitting across from him at Jerry's cluttered desk. It was less a question than a check. More or less, Logan said. The woman is worth about $4 billion. I know. And she wants to marry you. For a year. Jerry looked at him for a long moment over his reading glasses. Just making sure you've got the full picture. I've got the picture. The civil ceremony was on a Wednesday morning at the county courthouse in O'Neill. No guests. Victoria wore a dark blazer and her hair down. Logan wore his good shirt and the sport coat he kept for funerals and the occasional agriculture banquet. The county clerk, a woman named Ruth, who had probably seen stranger things in her years behind that counter, performed the ceremony with brisk efficiency and wished them well without much apparent conviction. Outside on the courthouse steps, Victoria's driver was waiting with the SUV. Her phone had been buzzing through most of the ceremony, and she checked it the moment they walked out. The announcement needs to go out today, she said. My communications team has a statement ready. We should also get a photograph. Logan looked at her. A photograph? Something natural, not posed, just... She glanced around the courthouse steps, the quiet main street of O'Neill visible behind them. Something that looks like it happened. He turned to face her. She was still looking at her phone. He waited until she looked up. Put the phone away for 60 seconds, he said. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. She put the phone in her coat pocket. He wasn't sure what made him do it. Probably stubbornness, probably something he'd tell himself later was purely practical. He reached up and straightened the collar of her blazer, which had flipped slightly in the wind. Just that. Just a small, ordinary gesture. But he could feel her go still under his hands in a way that made him realize she wasn't used to small, ordinary gestures. Her driver got the shot. It was exactly the kind of photograph her communications team needed. The first week was an education in how different two people's lives could be while technically occupying the same world. Victoria had an apartment in Omaha that was larger than his entire ranch house and twice as quiet. The kind of quiet that came from thick walls and expensive soundproofing, not from being genuinely out of earshot of the highway. She had a housekeeper who came 3 times a week. She had a personal assistant named Dana who communicated entirely through text messages and seemed to work approximately 22 hours a day. She also had enemies who wasted no time. The story broke on a Thursday. A small business publication, just a few paragraphs, carefully vague but pointed. Langford Ayres' sudden marriage raises questions about stability of leadership transition. By Friday, 2 more outlets had picked it up. By Monday, a full profile appeared in a Chicago financial magazine with the headline, Billionaire Princess's Surprise. Husband, love story, or PR strategy? Logan read it on his phone in the barn, crouched next to a sick calf he was monitoring for pneumonia. The piece had a photograph of him, pulled from the county fair records, of all places, and described him as a struggling Nebraska rancher with a recent foreclosure notice. Someone had already found the bank documents. They'd also found his wife's obituary, which meant they knew he was raising Sophie alone. He called Victoria. "I've seen it," she said before he finished his first sentence. "They've got Sophie's name." "I know. I've already spoken to our legal team. They can't publish photographs of her without consent, and we've sent notices. Her school has been quietly informed." A pause. "I should have anticipated this timeline. I'm sorry." He wasn't expecting the apology. It landed oddly. "What do we do?" he asked. "We live the story," she said. "We go about our lives and we live it. The more normal we appear, the less interesting we become." Another pause. "Can I come out to the ranch this weekend?" "You asking for permission?" "I'm asking what works for your schedule. I'm aware this is your home." He looked around the barn. The sick calf. The hay that needed turning. The broken latch on the east stall that he kept meaning to fix. "Saturday works," he said. "Sophie's got a birthday party in the afternoon. You can come in the morning." "I'll bring coffee," she said. "You don't have to bring coffee." "I know," she said. "I want to." Victoria Langford had never been anywhere like the Clearwater Ranch on a quiet Saturday morning. She knew that wasn't the kind of thing a person should say out loud, so she kept it to herself. But standing in the gap between the barn and the house at 7:45 in the morning, holding a paper bag with 2 large coffees and a box of pastries she'd stopped for in O'Neill, watching the light come across the flat land from the east in a long, slow pour of gold, she understood, for the first time in a long time, why people would fight to keep something. Logan came out of the barn before she reached it. He had hay in his hair and a look on his face that suggested her arrival had been earlier than expected. "You said morning," she said. "I said morning." He took the coffee she held out. "I just didn't think you were a 7:45 person. I don't sleep much." He looked at her. "Why not?" "Work." "Right." He sipped the coffee. "Come on, I'll show you around." It was not the guided tour she'd been anticipating, not a formal walkthrough, but the real version, the working version. He showed her the calf that had come through the pneumonia. He showed her the fence repair from the night they'd met, pointing out where the old wire had gone and where the new section started. He talked about the irrigation issues on the north pasture and the way the soil composition changed about halfway across the property and what that meant for what he could grow. He talked about the land the way she talked about quarterly projections, as something precise and complicated that he understood in his bones, something he'd spent years learning and was still learning. "You love this place," she said at some point. He looked sideways at her. "That surprise you?" "A little," she admitted. "Most people who are drowning in debt don't still love the thing that's drowning them. Most people have never had anything worth fighting for." She didn't have a response to that. She walked beside him in silence for a moment, her shoes, flat ankle boots this time, practical, picking through the damp grass. "Victoria." She looked up. Sophie was standing on the porch in her pajamas, the yellow duck ones, which seemed to be a standard, staring at her with the direct, unselfconscious scrutiny that only small children and very old people could get away with. "You're the lady from the picture," Sophie said. Victoria glanced at Logan. "I let her see the article," he said, with a tone that suggested this had been a judgment call he wasn't entirely at peace with. She was going to hear about it anyway. Victoria approached the porch. Sophie didn't move back or forward. She just kept looking. "What picture?" Victoria asked. "The one on the steps. You and Daddy." Sophie tilted her head. "You're really tall." "I'm wearing boots." Sophie considered this. "Are you really married to my dad?" Logan made a small sound behind her that was probably him stopping himself from intervening. Yes, Victoria said. We are. Do you love him? Silence. Victoria was aware of Logan, very still behind her. We care about each other, Victoria said carefully. That's why we got married. Sophie seemed to think about this with the seriousness of a small person who had not yet learned to accept incomplete answers. My mom died, Sophie said, in case you didn't know. I know, Victoria said. I'm sorry. Daddy says she's still here. Sophie tapped the center of her chest, not self-consciously, just matter of fact. I don't really remember her, but sometimes I feel like I do. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Something had shifted in her chest, something she wasn't prepared for. That's a good way to think about it, she said. Sophie examined her for one more long moment, then turned and went back inside. Logan came to stand beside Victoria. They both looked at the door where Sophie had disappeared. She's direct, Victoria said. Yeah. He paused. She gets that from her mother. Something in how he said it made Victoria keep her eyes forward. You don't have to answer kid questions, Logan said. I should have been. I'm glad she asked. Victoria looked at her coffee cup. It was an honest conversation. I don't have a lot of those anymore. He didn't respond to that, which she was grateful for. They stood there in the morning light for another moment, the two of them, on a porch that creaked slightly underfoot, while somewhere inside the farmhouse a 6-year-old in yellow pajamas padded back to her room. The first public event was a disaster, not a visible disaster, nothing anyone photographed badly or wrote about. But Victoria could see Logan's jaw set the moment they walked into the Langford Industries annual donor reception at the Hotel Fontanelle in Omaha, and it stayed set for most of the evening. It wasn't the room that did it. It was the people. She watched him navigate it. He was polite. He shook hands and answered questions and said things like, Victoria's told me a lot about this, and I'm still learning the business side of things with enough ease that most people accepted it at face value. But she could see what it cost him, the careful parsing of every sentence, the quiet vigilance of a man who knew he was being watched and assessed and measured against a standard he hadn't agreed to be measured against. Gerald Whitmore, her father's oldest board member, a man who had worn the same cologne for 40 years and had opinions about everything, cornered Logan near the bar and started asking pointed questions about crop subsidies. Logan answered them accurately. Whitmore looked surprised, then shifted to commodity futures. Logan answered that too. Whitmore's expression moved through something complicated and arrived at a kind of grudging respect that he clearly hadn't planned on extending. Victoria watched from across the room and felt something she couldn't immediately name, some mixture of amusement and something warmer and more unsettling. Later, in the car back, Logan loosened his tie and stared out the window. Whitmore wanted to know if I knew what I'd gotten into, he said. What did you tell him? Told him I figured it out as I went. A beat. He thought that was funny for some reason. Gerald Whitmore has not figured anything out as he went in 60 years, Victoria said. He plans everything down to his annual fishing trip. That kind of answer genuinely delights him. Logan glanced at her. The passing streetlights moved across his face. You've known him your whole life, Logan said. It wasn't a question. He used to come to our house for Christmas when I was small. He always brought the wrong gift. Something too old for me, like a chess set when I was 4. She paused. He came to my father's funeral and cried in the back row. I don't think he knew I saw. She wasn't sure why she'd said that last part. Logan was quiet for a moment. Your father. Do you miss him? Every day. He nodded, not commiserating exactly, just acknowledging. Mine died 6 years ago, Logan said, month before Sophie was born. Never met her. He was quiet again. There are days I'm glad he doesn't have to see how the ranch got this bad. And then I feel terrible for thinking that. That's not terrible, Victoria said. That's complicated. There's a difference. He looked at her the same way he'd looked at her on the courthouse steps, like she'd said something that surprised him. She turned back to her window. Outside, Omaha moved past them, lit up and busy and completely indifferent. Yeah. 3 weeks in, Garrett Hale made his first move. It came through a gossip column, a brief needling item suggesting that Victoria Langford's surprise marriage had been arranged by the same PR firm that had managed the optics around her father's estate battle. No names, no sources, but specific enough to feel informed. Dana forwarded it to Victoria at 6 in the morning with the note. He started. Victoria was at the ranch that morning. She read the message at the kitchen table while Logan made breakfast, and Sophie explained, at length and with significant detail, a dream she'd had about a horse that could talk but chose not to. "What are you going to do?" Logan asked. He was flipping pancakes. He hadn't looked at the article yet, but she'd told him the shape of it. "Nothing," she said. "Yet. That's hard for you." She looked up. He was still facing the stove. "Why would you say that?" "Because you're the kind of person who responds to things." He set a plate in front of Sophie without being asked. "You had an answer for every scenario before I finished asking the question, sitting on something while someone takes shots at you. That's not in your nature." Victoria looked at her phone, at the item, at the careful insinuation wrapped in vague language. "He's going to get worse," she said. "Probably. This is the test. If I respond now, I look rattled. If I don't—" "You look like you've got nothing to worry about," Logan said. He finally turned around and leaned against the counter with his own cup of coffee. "Which you shouldn't, because you don't." She looked at him. "Do you actually believe that?" she said. "Or are you just saying it?" He held her gaze for a moment. "I think you're smarter than him," Logan said simply. "And I think that drives him crazy. Which is why he's starting with gossip instead of something real." Sophie looked between the two of them. "What's gossip?" "When people say things that aren't true to make other people look bad," Logan told her. Sophie nodded solemnly. "Marcus at school does that." "What do you do when Marcus does that?" Victoria asked. Sophie shrugged, fork in hand. "Ignore him. He only does it because he wants people to pay attention to him." Logan and Victoria looked at each other across the kitchen table. "There you go," Logan said. Victoria looked down at her phone. She put it face down on the table. She drank her coffee. She did not respond to the item. Outside, the Nebraska morning was clear and cold, and across the flat land the light was the same gold it had been the first time she'd stood in it. And she thought, not for the first time, and with a discomfort she was only beginning to understand, that she could get used to this. That was the thought that unsettled her most. Not the corporate war, not the gossip columns, not Garrett Hale and his proxies and his strategies. The thought that she could get used to pancakes at 7 in the morning in a kitchen that smelled like old wood and coffee, while a 6-year-old explained a dream about a horse, and a man she'd met in a storm looked at her like she wasn't a liability to manage, but a person worth listening to. That was what scared her. That was what she hadn't put in the contract. The thing about living two lives was that neither one ever paused long enough to let you catch your breath. By the 4th week of the marriage, Logan had developed a routine that would have sounded absurd to anyone who'd known him 6 months earlier. Mondays through Wednesdays, he worked the ranch, feeding cattle, repairing what needed repairing, managing the handful of seasonal contracts that still kept money trickling in. Thursday mornings, he drove Sophie to school, then made the 3-hour trip to Omaha, where he spent Thursday evening and all of Friday being Victoria Langford's husband in the world that required it. Saturday mornings, he drove back. Sunday, he rested, or tried to, which mostly meant lying on the couch while Sophie watched cartoons, and his body reminded him that he wasn't 23 anymore. Victoria came to the ranch on alternating weekends. She had learned, by the 3rd visit, to leave the heels in the car. She kept a pair of flat boots in the mudroom now, next to Logan's, and the sight of them there, clean leather next to scuffed leather, small next to large, was the kind of detail that made the whole arrangement feel more real than any legal document could. Sophie had accepted Victoria's presence with the terrifying adaptability of a child who hadn't yet learned that adults were supposed to be complicated about things. She didn't call Victoria Mom. She didn't call her anything, really, for the first 2 weeks. Just looked at her when she wanted her attention and started talking. Then one morning, over cereal, she said, "Victoria, can you pass the milk?" And that was that. A name. A place in the architecture of the household. Done. Victoria, for her part, handled Sophie the way she handled most things. Carefully, with preparation, and with a degree of emotional restraint that sometimes looked like confidence and sometimes looked like fear. She didn't try to be a mother. She didn't try to be a friend. She occupied some middle space that didn't have a name yet, and Sophie seemed content to let it stay unnamed. It was Logan who was struggling, not with the logistics. The logistics were manageable. He could put on a suit and stand in a room full of people who measured success in zeros. He could answer questions about grain yields and pretend he didn't notice the way certain board members looked at his hands, calloused, scarred across the knuckles from a fencing accident 2 years ago, like they were evidence of something that disqualified him. What he was struggling with was the watching. He watched Victoria on the phone with her legal team at 11 at night, pacing the kitchen in socks, her voice controlled and precise, even when the news was bad. He watched her read bedtime stories to Sophie when he was late coming in from the barn, not because anyone asked her to, but because Sophie had asked and Victoria hadn't known how to say no. He watched her stand at the edge of the north pasture one evening, looking out at the sunset with an expression that was so unguarded, so stripped of the careful composure she wore like armor, that he'd turned around and gone back inside because it felt like seeing something he wasn't supposed to see. He was noticing her. That was the problem. Not as a business arrangement, not as a name on a contract, as a person who was tired and stubborn and surprisingly funny when she forgot to be careful, and who had a way of looking at Sophie that made something in his chest do things he hadn't authorized. He kept it to himself. He was good at that. The 5th week brought Garrett Hale out of the shadows. It started with a phone call. Victoria was in Omaha at her office on the 32nd floor of the Langford building when her assistant Dana appeared in the doorway looking like she'd swallowed something unpleasant. "He's online too," Dana said. Victoria didn't ask who. She picked up the phone and pressed the button. "Victoria." The voice was smooth, unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who had never been told to wait. "I hear congratulations are in order." "Garrett," she kept her own voice level. "What do you want?" "Just calling to wish you well. Marriage is a big step, especially one that happened so quickly." A pause, carefully timed. "I hope the board doesn't find the timing curious." "The board can find whatever it likes. My personal life isn't on their agenda." "Everything is on the agenda when there's a vote in 5 weeks." Another pause. "I've been learning about your husband. Interesting man, small ranch, big debts. The kind of story that writes itself, if someone wanted to write it." Victoria's hand tightened on the phone. She didn't let it reach her voice. "Is there a point to this call, Garrett? Or are you just practicing your threats?" He laughed. It was a warm sound, which made it worse. "No threats, just observation." "I observe things, Victoria. It's what I do. I observed your father for years, watched him build something impressive and then fail to plan for what came after. I'm observing you now." The warmth left his voice. "And what I'm observing is a woman who's running out of moves." "I appreciate the analysis," Victoria said. "I'll file it with the rest of your opinions." She hung up before he could respond. Her hands were shaking. She put them flat on the desk and pressed down until they stopped. She called Logan that evening. He was in the barn. She could hear the ambient noise, the low sound of animals, the creak of old wood. "He called me directly," she said. "What did he say?" "That he knows about you, about the debts. He's going to use it." Logan was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing, slow and even. Working breathing, the kind that came from physical labor. "Let him," Logan said. "You don't understand what he can do with that information. He'll frame the whole marriage as a transaction. Desperate rancher, calculating heiress. It'll play perfectly for the shareholders who already think I'm Victoria." His voice cut through hers, not sharp but steady. "Let him." She stopped talking. "The man buys family farms and tears them apart," Logan said. "He strips companies for profit. He called you to scare you because that's the only play he has left that doesn't cost him money. If the best he can do is point at me and say I'm broke, well, half the people in this county are broke. That's not a scandal. That's a Tuesday." She was quiet for a long time. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "What did you expect?" "Someone who would panic." "I've got a 6-year-old who once put a live frog in the washing machine," Logan said. "My panic threshold is pretty high." She almost laughed. She caught herself, which annoyed her because catching yourself before you laughed at something genuinely funny was exactly the kind of thing she'd been doing her entire life, and she was getting tired of it. "I need to come to the ranch this weekend," she said. "We should prepare for what's coming." "Come Friday," he said. "Sophie's been asking about you." That landed somewhere she wasn't ready for it to land. She said goodnight and hung up and sat in her office for another 20 minutes, looking at the Omaha skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows, thinking about a 6-year-old in yellow pajamas who had been asking about her. Victoria arrived at the ranch Friday evening with 2 boxes of files, a laptop, and a bag of groceries she'd picked up in town because Logan had mentioned offhandedly that he was low on milk and eggs and the things Sophie liked for breakfast. She found him on the porch, sitting in the old wooden chair with a beer, watching the last light drain out of the sky. Sophie was already asleep. It was past 8, and she'd had a long day at school involving some kind of science project about weather that had left her exhausted and covered in glitter. Victoria sat down in the other chair. It creaked under her. "Tell me about him," she said. "Garrett Hale, not the business version, the real version." Logan took a drink of his beer. "You probably know more than I do. I know the facts. I want to know what people around here say." He thought about it. "Dale Hutchins, my neighbor, the one who sold, he told me Hale's people came to him 3 times before he agreed. First time, they offered market price. Second time, they offered above market. Third time, they showed up with a county inspector who found code violations on his barn that nobody had cared about for 30 years. He paused. Dale said it wasn't the money that broke him. It was the feeling that they could just keep coming, and he couldn't keep them out. Victoria stared at the darkening horizon. That's his method. He doesn't fight you head on. He makes you tired. Sounds like someone who's never been in an actual fight. He hasn't. That's the thing about Garrett. He's never had to be. He inherited money, used it to make more money, and hired people to do the parts that required getting dirty. She turned to look at Logan. He's not stupid, though. Don't make that mistake. He's patient, and he's strategic, and he understands leverage better than anyone I've ever met. Better than you? She considered the question seriously. Different than me. I was raised to build things. He was raised to acquire them. Those require different kinds of intelligence. Which kind wins? Depends on who gets tired first. They sat in the quiet for a while. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote started up. That thin, rising cry that carried across flat land like it had no intention of stopping. Another answered it, then another. "Your father," Logan said. "What was he like?" Victoria was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. "Complicated," she said finally. "He was brilliant and demanding and sometimes cruel in ways he didn't recognize as cruelty. He built Langford Industries from a regional equipment supplier into a national operation. And he did it by working harder than anyone around him and expecting everyone else to keep up." She paused. "He never told me he was proud of me, not once. But he left me the company, which I suppose was his version of saying it." "That's a heavy way to say it." "He was a heavy person." She looked at her hands. "When he died, I found a letter in his desk, not addressed to anyone, just a list of things he wanted to do differently. Take more time off, learn to cook. Tell Victoria she's doing fine." Her voice stayed even, but something underneath it wasn't. "He never sent it. He never did any of it. He just wrote it down and put it in a drawer." Logan didn't say anything. He didn't try to fill the silence with comfort or perspective or any of the things people usually offered. He just sat there in the chair next to hers and let the silence be what it was. After a while, Victoria said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For not telling me he loved me in his own way, or that I should focus on the good memories, or any of the other things people say when they don't know what to say." "I don't know what to say," Logan said. "I'm just honest about it." She looked at him. In the dark, his face was hard to read, but his voice wasn't. His voice was the same as it always was, direct, unhurried, stripped of performance. She was beginning to understand that this was simply who he was, not a strategy or a persona, but the actual architecture of the man, and that understanding was becoming a problem she didn't have a contingency plan for. The weekend passed the way ranch weekends did, in work and weather, and the small domestic rhythms that Victoria was learning without meaning to. She helped Logan fix a gate latch on Saturday morning, holding the new hardware in place while he drove the screws, and he didn't comment on the fact that her hands were steady or that she'd anticipated which tool he needed before he asked for it. She made lunch, nothing elaborate, just sandwiches and soup from a can, and Sophie ate beside her and talked about the weather project and the glitter and a girl named Emma, who was her best friend except on days when Emma was mean, which was about half the days. Saturday afternoon, Victoria spread her files across the kitchen table and worked through the shareholder projections while Logan took Sophie to the park in town. She heard them come back, the truck door, Sophie's voice carrying across the yard, Logan's lower register answering, and she realized she'd been listening for them. Not consciously, just the way you listen for sounds that have become part of the rhythm of a place. That evening, after Sophie was in bed, Logan found Victoria on the porch again, but this time she wasn't sitting. She was standing at the railing, her phone pressed to her ear, and her voice had a quality he hadn't heard before, but not angry, not controlled, but something raw, scared, maybe. He waited until she hung up. "What happened?" he said. She turned around. Her face was tight. "Garrett filed a motion with the SEC," she said. "He's claiming irregularities in the leadership transition after my father's death. He's requesting a formal review of all board appointments made in the last 14 months. She pressed her hands against the railing. "It's a stalling tactic. He knows the review will take weeks, and if the board appointments are under question, those board members can't vote in the shareholder meeting." "Can he do that?" "He can file anything he wants. The question is whether the SEC takes it seriously." She exhaled. "And even if they don't, the filing itself creates doubt. Shareholders see an SEC inquiry and they get nervous. Nervous shareholders sell. Garrett buys." "How many votes does he need?" "He's at 41%. He needs 51. The board members he's trying to disqualify control about 8% of committed votes." She looked at him. "If those votes are suspended during the review, he only needs 2% more from the open market." Logan leaned against the porch post. "What do your lawyers say?" "That we can fight the motion, but it'll take time we don't have. The vote is in 4 weeks. "And what do you say?" She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the yard, carrying the smell of grass and earth and the faint mineral scent of the creek bed. "I say I'm tired of playing defense," she said. "Then don't." She looked at him. "You've been reacting to everything he does," Logan said. "The gossip column. You didn't respond. The phone call. You hung up. The SEC filing. You're talking about fighting the motion. It's all response. When do you make him respond to you?" Victoria stared at him. The porch light caught the edge of her face, the line of her jaw, the tension in her shoulders. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm a rancher, not a corporate strategist, but I know that when a coyote keeps coming after your herd, you don't just build a higher fence. You go find the coyote." Something changed in her expression. Not softening, sharpening. The look of someone whose mind had just shifted gears. "The land acquisitions," she said slowly. "Midland Horizon. Garrett's been buying those farms through shell companies. If we can connect those purchases directly to him, show that he's using Langford's potential assets to fund a private land grab." "That's not just bad optics," Logan said. "That's a conflict of interest. It's more than that. If he's using insider knowledge of Langford's distribution network to identify which farms to target, knowing which suppliers we depend on, which regions are critical to our supply chain, that's potentially actionable." She was pacing now. Not the controlled back and forth of her phone calls, but something more alive, more urgent. "Dale Hutchins," Logan said. "He talked to you. He's got documentation, the offers, the inspector visits, the timeline. And he's not the only one. There are 3 other families in this county alone who went through the same thing." Victoria stopped pacing. She looked at him with an intensity that made the air between them feel different. "Can you get them to meet with me?" she said. "I can ask." "Will they trust me?" The question was genuine. He could hear it, the uncertainty underneath, the awareness that she was asking people who'd lost their land to trust a billionaire. "They'll trust me," Logan said, "and I'll tell them you're worth trusting." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you say that? You barely know me." "I know enough." He straightened up from the porch post. "I know you read my kid bedtime stories when you don't have to. I know you drove 3 hours in a storm to ask a stranger for help instead of just buying your way out. I know you kept a letter your father never sent because throwing it away felt like losing him twice. He paused. That's enough. Victoria opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. You're going to make this very difficult, she said quietly. Make what difficult? She didn't answer. She turned back to the railing and looked out at the dark. He stood beside her, not touching, not speaking, just present. The coyotes had gone quiet. The night was enormous and still and full of things neither of them were ready to say. After a while, she went inside. He heard her footsteps in the kitchen, the soft sound of the cabinet opening, the kettle going on. The ordinary sounds of someone making themselves at home in a house that wasn't theirs, in a life that wasn't supposed to be real. Logan stayed on the porch for another 10 minutes, alone with the dark and the smell of the land and the growing certainty that the contract sitting in his filing cabinet, the one with the 12-month expiration date and the clean, clinical language of a business arrangement, had stopped describing what was actually happening a long time ago. He just didn't know what to do about it yet. Inside, the kettle whistled. Victoria's voice called out from the kitchen, quiet, so as not to wake Sophie, asking if he wanted tea. He went inside. He said yes. The meetings happened faster than Logan expected. Dale Hutchins said yes before Logan finished asking. He came to the ranch on a Tuesday evening with a cardboard box full of papers, letters, emails printed out on his home printer, receipts from the county inspector visits, and a handwritten timeline of every interaction he'd had with Midland Horizon Holdings from the first offer to the day he signed over his land. His wife, Carol, came with him. She didn't say much, but she sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and watched Victoria with the particular attention of a woman deciding whether to trust someone. They came 3 times, Dale said. He was 64, weathered in the way that men who'd worked outside their whole lives got weathered. Not rugged, just used. First time was friendly. Young guy, nice car, said they were interested in agricultural investment, offered fair market. I said no thank you. When was this? Victoria asked. She had a legal pad in front of her and was writing in a tight, rapid hand that Logan had never seen her use before. March, 2 years back, second time was October. Different guy, same company. Offered 20% above market. I said no again. Dale paused. He looked at the table. Third time was the following spring. That's when the inspector showed up. The county inspector, Victoria said. Building inspector. Said he'd received a complaint about structural issues with our main barn. Nobody had complained. We'd been out there 40 years and nobody ever said a word about that barn. But he found violations, 4 of them, gave us 90 days to bring it up to code or face fines. How much to fix it? $62,000. Dale's voice was flat. We didn't have $62,000. We barely had 6. Carol spoke for the first time. The Midland people called the next week. Same offer, 20% above market. Dale told them to go to hell. She looked at her husband. Then the bank called. Dale nodded slowly. Our mortgage holder, First Prairie, out of Grand Island, sent a notice saying they were reviewing our loan terms. Said there was a clause about property condition that the inspection violations triggered a reassessment. He spread his hands on the table. We'd never missed a payment. 31 years. Not one late payment, but suddenly they're talking about default risk and accelerated repayment schedules. First Prairie, Victoria said. She'd stopped writing. Do you still have the loan documents? The original terms? Everything's in the box. Victoria looked at Logan. Something passed between them. Not words, just a shared recognition of what they were hearing. A pattern. A system. Dale, Victoria said, and her voice had shifted into something that Logan recognized, not the controlled corporate tone she used on the phone with lawyers. Something harder. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Dale looked at her steadily. Go ahead. Did anyone from Midland Horizon ever mention Langford Industries? My company, my family name, anything connected to our supply chain? Dale thought about it. He looked at Carol. She shook her head. Not directly, Dale said. But the second guy, the one who came in October, he knew things. He knew who our equipment suppliers were. He knew our yield numbers from the previous 3 years. He knew we'd put in a request for a new irrigation grant through the state ag department. He paused. That's not public information. Not all of it. Victoria wrote something on her pad, underlined it twice, and set the pen down. I need to talk to the other families, she said. The ones who sold. I can get you the Muellers, Logan said, and probably the Kentons. Jim Kenton's still in town. He's working at the feed store now. The Petersons moved to Kearney, Dale added, but I've got Linda's number. She'll talk. She's been wanting to talk about this for a year. Victoria nodded. She reached across the table and put her hand on the cardboard box of documents. I'm going to make copies of everything in here, she said, and I'm going to have my legal team review every piece of it. If what I think happened actually happened, if Garrett Hale used insider access to Langford's distribution data to identify vulnerable farms for acquisition, that's not just unethical, that's potentially criminal. Dale looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Logan. She always talk like this? Dale asked. Pretty much, Logan said. Dale turned back to Victoria. You really think you can do something? I think I can try, she said, and I think trying is better than what's been happening, which is nothing. Carol reached over and squeezed her husband's hand. Dale cleared his throat. All right then, he said, let's try. Over the next 2 weeks, Victoria built her case the way she built everything, methodically, thoroughly, and with a relentlessness that Logan found both impressive and slightly alarming. She met with 4 families in total. She collected documents, cross-referenced timelines, and had her forensic accounting team trace the financial connections between Midland Horizon Holdings and 3 shell companies that all led back to the same investment group registered in Delaware. She also found the link to Langford Industries. It was buried in a data-sharing agreement that Garrett Hale's company had signed with one of Langford's regional distribution partners, a small logistics firm called Prairie Route that handled equipment deliveries across rural Nebraska. The agreement gave Midland Horizon access to delivery schedules, client lists, and order histories. From that data, it would have been straightforward to identify which farms were most dependent on Langford equipment, which ones were behind on payments, and which ones were vulnerable. He mapped the supply chain, Victoria told Logan, standing in the kitchen at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, papers spread across every surface. He used our own distribution network to find the weakest links, then he went after them. And nobody at Langford noticed? The agreement was signed through a subsidiary. My father may have known about it. It was signed 8 months before he died, or he may not have. Prairie Route is a small outfit. This kind of partnership wouldn't have crossed his desk. She rubbed her eyes. But Garrett knew exactly what he was buying. What do you do with this? I present it to the board, publicly, before the shareholder vote. She looked at him. If I can show that Garrett Hale used his position as a Langford shareholder to access proprietary data for personal land acquisitions, his credibility collapses. Shareholders won't back someone who's been using the company as a personal intelligence service. Will it be enough? She was quiet for a moment. I don't know. It should be. But should and will are different words. Logan looked at her standing there, surrounded by evidence and exhaustion, and he wanted to tell her something he'd been carrying for days, something about how watching her fight for other people's land she'd never worked, families she'd never known, had changed something in the way he understood her. But the words felt too large for the kitchen, too heavy for midnight, so he just handed her the cup of tea he'd made and said, "You should sleep." "I will," she said, which they both knew was a lie. The county fair came the following Saturday, the way it did every September in Holt County. A sprawl of tents and livestock pens and carnival rides spread across the fairgrounds outside O'Neill. Logan had been taking Sophie since she was old enough to point at things, and he wasn't about to stop now, regardless of what else was happening. Sophie had been talking about it for 2 weeks. She wanted funnel cake. She wanted to see the pigs. She wanted to ride the Ferris wheel, which she'd been too short for last year, and was praying she'd grown enough to qualify for this time. Victoria came with them. It was her idea, or maybe Sophie's. Logan couldn't remember who'd suggested it first, only that by Friday evening it was decided. And on Saturday morning, Victoria appeared in jeans and a flannel shirt she'd clearly purchased recently, because it still had the fold creases, and boots that had actual dust on them from the ranch. "Don't say anything," she said when she caught Logan looking at the shirt. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were going to say something about the flannel." I was going to say it looks good. He said it before he thought about it, and then it was out there, and Victoria looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between surprised and careful. Sophie, oblivious to all of this, was already in the truck yelling about funnel cake. The fair was crowded. It was always crowded. One of those community events that drew people from 3 counties because there wasn't much else to do in September in rural Nebraska, and because the pie competition was legitimately fierce. Logan knew most of the people there, or at least recognized them. He shook hands and introduced Victoria and watched the way people received her, curious mostly, with that particular Nebraska reserve that could look like coldness but was really just caution. Victoria handled it well, better than the Omaha reception actually. She asked questions. She listened to the answers. She complimented someone's hog in a way that managed to sound genuine rather than condescending, which Logan considered a significant achievement for someone who'd probably never been within 50 feet of a hog before. Sophie, meanwhile, was in her element. She dragged them from booth to booth, demanded and received funnel cake, and made friends with 2 other girls at the duck pond game within approximately 90 seconds. Logan watched her and felt that specific parental ache, the one that came from seeing your kid be happy and knowing how much you'd sacrifice to keep it that way. At 2 o'clock, Sophie wanted to ride the Ferris wheel. She was tall enough now, barely, by maybe half an inch, but the teenager running the ride didn't argue. Sophie screamed with delight and insisted on going twice. At 2:30, Victoria's phone rang. She stepped away to take the call. Logan saw her face change, saw the careful mask go on, and knew it was something about the case. "What is it?" he asked when she came back. "The SEC motion. They're expediting the review. Garrett's lawyers pushed for it." "Is that bad?" "It's not good, but it doesn't change anything. The board presentation is scheduled for next week. Everything is ready." She put her phone away. "I'm not going to think about it right now." "Okay," he said. "I'm going to eat another funnel cake and watch Sophie ride the Ferris wheel again." "That sounds like a plan." She looked at him, and for a moment, just a moment, the mask was gone, and what was underneath was something he recognized because he'd been feeling it too. The terrifying, inconvenient, completely unplanned realization that this temporary thing was becoming permanent in all the ways that mattered. Then Sophie came running up, asking for cotton candy, and the moment passed. It was 3:15 when Logan lost sight of her. He was at the lemonade stand, buying drinks. One for him, one for Victoria, one for Sophie. The line was long. Victoria was 20 yards away near the craft tent, looking at something on her phone. Sophie had been right there, right beside her, looking at a display of handmade dolls. When Logan turned around with 3 lemonades, Victoria was still at the craft tent. Sophie was not. He didn't panic immediately. Kids wandered at fairs. It was normal. He walked over to Victoria and said, "Where's Sophie?" Victoria looked up from her phone. She looked around. Her expression shifted. "She was right here," Victoria said. "She was looking at the dolls. She stopped, looked at her phone, looked back at the empty space beside the craft tent. "She was right here 30 seconds ago." Logan set the lemonades down on the nearest surface. "Sophie!" he called, loud enough to turn heads. "Sophie!" No answer. He walked to the doll display. The woman running it, a middle-aged lady in a straw hat, looked up. "The little girl," Logan said. "My daughter. Blonde hair, pink shirt. She was just here." "She walked off that way," the woman said, pointing toward the livestock barn. "Maybe 2 minutes ago. She was following someone." "Following who?" "A man. I figured it was someone she knew. She seemed happy." Logan's blood went cold. He started walking fast toward the livestock barn, calling Sophie's name. Victoria was behind him, matching his pace, her phone already in her hand. "I'm calling the sheriff," she said. "Do it." The livestock barn was long and dim and smelled like hay and animal. Logan moved through it quickly, checking every row, every pen. People looked at him. The urgency was visible, the kind of movement that made strangers step aside. Sophie was not in the barn. He came out the back side and looked across the open field behind the fairgrounds. Parking lot. Trucks and cars baking in the afternoon sun. Nobody walking, nobody running. "Sophie!" His voice broke on the second syllable. He didn't care. "Sophie!" Victoria was beside him now, her phone against her ear. Sheriff's office, this is Victoria Langford. I'm at the Holt County Fairgrounds. A child is missing. 6 years old, blonde hair, pink t-shirt. Her name is Sophie Hayes. Her voice was steady, controlled, professional. Her hand was shaking. Logan was already moving through the parking lot, checking between vehicles, calling Sophie's name. Every car door, every truck bed, every shadow. Nothing. Nothing. 5 minutes, then 10. Then the sheriff's deputy arrived, a young guy named Rollins who Logan recognized, and the word started spreading through the fair. People stopped what they were doing. Other parents pulled their children close. Volunteers began fanning out across the grounds. Logan stood in the middle of the fairground with his hands on his knees, breathing hard, and felt the world narrowing to a single unbearable point. Victoria put her hand on his back. He hadn't heard her approach. "We'll find her," she said. "You don't know that. I know that I'm going to use every resource I have until we do." Her voice had a quality he'd never heard before, not corporate, not controlled, raw. "Whatever it takes, whatever it costs. Do you hear me?" He straightened up. He looked at her. Her eyes were wet and she wasn't hiding it. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered it. "Mr. Hayes." The voice was male, calm, unfamiliar. "Your daughter is safe. She'll remain safe provided you and Ms. Langford withdraw from the Langford Industries shareholder proceedings within the next 48 hours. Logan couldn't speak. His chest had locked up. Victoria was watching his face, reading it, and he saw the moment she understood. "I want to hear her voice," Logan said. His own voice didn't sound like him. A pause. Then, "Daddy?" Sophie, small, scared, but alive. "Hey, Bug." He pressed the phone against his ear so hard it hurt. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" "I want to come home. The man said we were going to see horses, but there aren't any horses, and I want to come home." "I know, baby, I know. I'm coming to get you. I promise." The line went dead. Logan stood there for 3 seconds. Then he turned to Victoria and told her exactly what the caller had said, word for word, because his mind had recorded it with the precision of absolute terror. Victoria's face went through something he'd never seen before, a series of expressions that moved so fast they were almost invisible. Shock, fury, and then something cold and focused that settled over her features like a door closing. "Give me the number," she said. "I'm calling my security team." "They said 48 hours. "I heard what they said." She took his phone, looked at the call log, and started dialing on her own phone. "They took a child. They took your child. I don't care what they said." Within the hour, Victoria had assembled a response that made the sheriff's department look like a neighborhood watch. Her personal security detail, 3 people, former federal agents based in Omaha, arrived by helicopter. Her legal team filed an emergency report with the FBI field office in Lincoln. Her tech consultants began tracing the phone call. Logan sat in the sheriff's station and watched all of it happen and felt something he didn't know how to name. Gratitude so large it was almost indistinguishable from grief. "The call pinged off a tower near Chambers," Victoria's head of security said. His name was Marcus Webb, a square-jawed man in his 50s who spoke the way people spoke when they'd spent decades in rooms where precision mattered. "That's about 40 miles northwest. The signal bounced, but our team is narrowing the area." "What's out near Chambers?" Logan asked. "Not much. Agricultural land, mostly. A few abandoned properties." Webb paused. "There's an old grain elevator complex, Prairie Star, shut down about 5 years ago. It's been on Midland Horizon's acquisition list." Logan and Victoria looked at each other. "Midland Horizon," Victoria said. "He wouldn't," Logan said. But even as he said it, he knew. Of course he would. A man who manufactured building code violations to steal family farms. A man who filed fraudulent SEC motions to disqualify board votes. Of course he would. "We don't have proof it's Hale," Webb said. "We have a connection. That's not the same thing." "It's enough to look," Logan said. He stood up. "I'm going." "Mr. Hayes, my daughter is in a building 40 miles from here and you're telling me there's a connection. I'm going." Victoria stood up too. "I'm coming with you." "No," Logan said. "Stay here. Coordinate with the FBI. If something happens, I need to be there." She looked at him, and there was nothing corporate left in her, nothing careful, nothing strategic, nothing calculated, just a woman who was terrified for a child she hadn't planned to love. She asked for me yesterday. Did you know that? She asked where I was. She drew another picture, 3 people in front of the house. She's not confused about who I am anymore, Logan, and I'm not either. He stared at her. We go together, she said. The drive to Chambers took 53 minutes. Webb drove. Victoria sat in the front, on the phone with the FBI liaison, mapping the property records for the Prairie Star grain facility. Logan sat in the back seat and stared at the dark Nebraska landscape sliding past the windows and tried not to think about Sophie in a strange building with a stranger, scared and waiting. He failed at that. He thought about nothing else. The grain facility was visible from half a mile away. A cluster of tall concrete silos and a low metal processing building, all of it dark, all of it fenced with chain link that had gaps large enough to walk through. Webb cut the headlights a quarter mile out and pulled off the county road onto a dirt track. Vehicle, he said quietly, pointing. A dark sedan was parked near the processing building, no lights visible. Logan was out of the car before Webb finished talking. Victoria grabbed his arm. Wait, she said, please, 2 minutes. Let Marcus assess. 2 minutes. He gave her 2 minutes because she asked and because Webb was already moving toward the facility in a low professional crouch, talking quietly into his radio. 2 more security operatives who'd driven separately were approaching from the east side. The 2 minutes lasted forever. Then Webb's voice came through the radio, low and tight. One individual visible inside the processing building, ground floor. Child appears to be present, no weapons visible. Logan moved. He went through the gap in the fence and crossed the concrete yard in long, fast strides. Not running because running would make noise, but moving with the urgent, controlled speed of a man who had spent his whole life moving across uneven ground in the dark. He could hear Victoria behind him, her footsteps lighter, keeping pace. The processing building's side door was unlocked. He pushed it open. The interior was vast and dim, a single overhead light, the kind that ran on batteries, casting a cold circle on the concrete floor. Old equipment lined the walls, conveyor housings and grain chutes thick with dust. In the center of the light, sitting on a metal folding chair with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, was Sophie. She saw him before the man standing near her did. "Daddy!" She was off the chair and running before Logan could process anything else. He dropped to his knees and caught her, and she hit him with the full force of a 6-year-old's terror and relief, her arms around his neck so tight he couldn't breathe and didn't want to. "I'm here," he said. "I've got you. I've got you." The man, mid-30s, nondescript, the kind of face you'd forget in a crowd, took 1 step backward and found Webb behind him. Webb didn't say anything dramatic. He just put a hand on the man's shoulder with the kind of grip that communicated everything necessary. Victoria came through the door. She stopped when she saw Sophie in Logan's arms. She stood there, her hand against the door frame, and she didn't move for a long moment. Then Sophie lifted her head from Logan's shoulder and looked at her. "Victoria," Sophie said, and reached one arm out. Victoria crossed the space between them and knelt on the cold concrete floor in her jeans and flannel shirt and put her arms around both of them, Logan and Sophie together, and held on. Nobody spoke. The old building creaked around them. Somewhere outside, the sound of approaching vehicles, FBI, Sheriff's Department, the machinery of consequence arriving. Sophie's voice muffled against Logan's chest. "Can we go home now?" "Yeah, Bug," Logan said. His voice was wrecked. "We can go home." He felt Victoria's hand on the back of his head, just resting there, and he closed his eyes, and for the first time in hours he could breathe again. Sophie slept in Logan's bed that night, curled against his side with her fist closed around the collar of his shirt, the way she used to do when she was 2, and the world was too big, and the only safe place was wherever he was. He didn't sleep. He lay in the dark and listened to her breathe, and counted each breath like currency, like proof, like evidence that the worst thing he'd ever imagined had happened, and they'd come out the other side of it. Victoria was in the kitchen. He knew because he could hear her. Not pacing, not talking on the phone, just existing in the next room. The occasional shift of a chair, the sound of a cup being set down, the quiet, restless presence of someone who also couldn't sleep but was trying to give him space. At 3 in the morning, He eased himself out of bed without waking Sophie and went to the kitchen. Victoria was at the table with her laptop open, but the screen had gone dark. She was just sitting there, her hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold, staring at the wall. She looked up when he came in. "How is she?" Victoria asked. "Sleeping. She'll be okay." He sat down across from her. "You should sleep too. I keep thinking about what would have happened if we hadn't found her." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were red-rimmed. "I keep running the other version in my head." "Don't. I can't stop." "Victoria." He leaned forward. "She's here. She's in the next room. She's safe. Because we got lucky, because Webb's team traced the call fast enough, because the man they hired was incompetent enough to leave a car visible from the road." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "Luck is not a strategy, Logan. Luck is what happens when everything else fails. Sometimes luck is enough. It shouldn't have to be." She looked at him, and the controlled, composed woman he'd met on his porch 2 months ago was nowhere in sight. What was left was someone raw and furious and scared in a way that went deeper than corporate strategy or shareholder votes. "This is my fault." "No, it isn't. I brought this into your life. I knocked on your door in a storm and asked you to step into my mess, and now your daughter—" "Stop." His voice was quiet, but it had an edge. "You didn't take Sophie. A man working for Garrett Hale took Sophie. You helped get her back. You got on your knees on a concrete floor in an abandoned grain elevator and held my kid. That's what happened. That's the version that's real." Victoria closed her eyes. A tear ran down her left cheek and she wiped it away with the back of her hand, quickly, like she was angry at it for existing. "I've never been this scared about anything," she said. "Not the company, not the vote, not Garrett. I've been scared about all of those things, but not like this." She opened her eyes. "I didn't know I could be scared like this about someone else's child." But Logan looked at her for a long time. "She's not someone else's child," he said. "Not anymore." Victoria's breath caught. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The kitchen was quiet around them, the old house doing its familiar settling sounds, and somewhere in the next room, Sophie breathed in and out in the steady rhythm of a child who trusted that morning would come, and that when it did, the people she needed would still be there. The FBI took the man into custody that night. His name was Carl Rennick, a private contractor with a security background and a record of working for companies that needed problems handled discreetly. He wasn't talking, not at first, but by Monday morning, his lawyer had negotiated a cooperation agreement, and what came out was worse than Victoria had anticipated. Rennick had been hired through a chain of intermediaries, but the instruction chain led back to a consulting firm called Ashford Strategic Partners, which had exactly one significant client, Midland Horizon Holdings. The payment for the kidnapping, wired to Rennick's account from an offshore entity, had been routed through the same financial infrastructure that Garrett Hale used for his land acquisitions. Webb delivered the report to Victoria at the ranch on Tuesday, while Logan was outside with Sophie. Victoria read it twice, then set it down and stared at the wall. "He ordered it," she said. "The evidence suggests a clear connection," Webb said, careful with his language, the way people were careful when they knew documents would eventually be entered into record. Whether Hale himself gave the specific instruction or whether someone in his organization acted with presumed authority, that's for the federal investigation to determine. But the money came from his network. Yes. And the man they hired was connected to his consulting firm. Yes. Victoria stood up and walked to the window. Outside, Logan was pushing Sophie on the old tire swing that hung from the oak tree behind the house. Sophie was laughing, that uninhibited, full-body laughter that children produced without effort and adults spent their whole lives trying to recover. Logan was smiling, but Victoria could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing toward the road, the new vigilance that hadn't been there a week ago and might never fully go away. "What happens now?" she asked. "Legally? The FBI is building a case. Rennick's cooperation will be central. The financial trail gives them probable cause for warrants on Ashford Strategic and potentially on Midland Horizon's records directly." Webb paused. "In terms of the corporate situation, the shareholder vote, this changes the landscape significantly." "The board meeting is in 10 days, Victoria said. "I'm aware. She turned from the window. If this goes public before the vote, if shareholders learn that Garrett Hale's organization kidnapped a child to prevent me from presenting evidence of his fraud, it's over for him. The FBI may not want it public yet. They're building a case. Premature disclosure could compromise. I understand that. Her voice was sharp. She caught herself, breathed. I understand. I'm not going to compromise a federal investigation. But there are things I can present at the board meeting that don't touch the kidnapping. The land acquisitions, the data sharing agreement, the pattern of manufactured pressure on farm families. She picked up the report and put it in her portfolio. The kidnapping proves what kind of man he is. The financial evidence proves what kind of businessman he is. The board needs to see the second, and the FBI can handle the first. Webb nodded. I'll coordinate with the field office. Thank you, Marcus. He left. Victoria sat back down at the table and put her head in her hands for 30 seconds. She counted, and then she lifted her head and opened her laptop and started working. Outside, Sophie's laughter carried through the window. The next week was the hardest of Victoria's life, and she'd lived through some hard weeks. She prepared for the board presentation with the kind of methodical intensity that had gotten her through her father's death, through the first year of running a company that half the industry thought she'd inherited by accident, through every late night and early morning and quiet moment of doubt that she'd never let anyone see. She reviewed every document. She rehearsed every argument. She anticipated every possible counterattack Garrett Hale's representatives might launch during the meeting. She also did something she hadn't done in years. She asked for help, not from her lawyers or her consultants or her security team. From Logan. I need you at the board meeting, she told him 3 days before the vote. They were on the porch, their porch. She'd started thinking of it that way without meaning to. In the late evening, the sky doing that Nebraska thing where it went from orange to purple to black in stages so gradual you couldn't tell where one ended and the next began. You want me in the room, Logan said. I want you at the table, not as a prop, not as a visual aid. She turned to face him. As someone who can tell those shareholders what Garrett Hale's operation looks like from ground level, what it does to families, what it did to Dale Hutchins and the Muellers and the Kentons, what it almost did to Sophie. She paused. They'll listen to you. Why? Because you're the thing they're supposed to be protecting. Independent farmers, rural communities. The people Langford Industries was built to serve. She looked at her hands. My father started this company because he believed that the people who fed the country deserved better equipment, better infrastructure, better support. That's the mission statement. It's on the wall in the boardroom. Most of the board members haven't read it in years. And you think hearing it from me will remind them. I think hearing what they're about to lose, what they've already helped lose by letting Garrett Hale get this close, might wake them up. Logan was quiet for a long time. He looked out at the dark land. What do I say? He asked. The truth. That's all. Just tell them the truth. The truth is complicated. It always is. That's what makes it convincing. He looked at her sideways. You know, for a billionaire, you're not half bad at this. At what? Being a person. She laughed. A real laugh, startled out of her, the kind she'd been catching and killing for years. It sounded strange coming from her own mouth, rougher than she expected, less polished, more human. That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me, she said. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. She laughed again, and this time she didn't catch it. The board meeting was held at Langford Industries headquarters in Omaha, in a conference room on the 32nd floor that had been designed to impress. Long table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. 17 people around the table, including board members, legal counsel, shareholder representatives, and Garrett Hale himself. Logan had seen photographs of Hale in the documents Victoria had compiled, but the photographs hadn't prepared him for the man in person. Garrett Hale was 53, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and had the particular confidence of someone who had spent decades in rooms where he was the most powerful person present. He sat at the far end of the table with 2 lawyers flanking him and looked at Logan the way you'd look at a piece of furniture that had been placed in an unexpected location. Not threatened, just mildly puzzled. Victoria opened the meeting. She was different here. Not the woman from the ranch kitchen, not the woman who'd knelt on a concrete floor. This was the version of Victoria Langford that had been trained from birth for rooms exactly like this: precise, authoritative, commanding in a way that came not from volume, but from absolute preparedness. She presented the financial evidence methodically. The Midland Horizon Shell Companies, the data sharing agreement through Prairie Route, the timeline showing how farm acquisitions corresponded with access to Langford's proprietary distribution data. The room was quiet. Logan watched the board members' faces, some shocked, some troubled, some carefully neutral. Gerald Whitmore, the old board member who'd quizzed Logan about crop subsidies at the donor reception, was leaning forward with his hands clasped, his expression grim. Garrett Hale watched the presentation with a small, fixed smile. When Victoria finished, Hale's lead attorney, a tall woman named Catherine Price, spoke first. "These are serious allegations, Ms. Langford, but allegations aren't evidence. You've shown correlations, not causation. The data sharing agreement with Prairie Route was a standard logistics partnership. Standard logistics partnerships don't include client financial data," Victoria said. The agreement gave Midland Horizon access to order histories, payment schedules, and credit standings for every farm in Langford's Nebraska distribution network. That's not logistics. That's intelligence. "The agreement was signed under your father's leadership," Price said smoothly. "If there was an oversight in scope, I'm not here to defend my father's decisions. I'm here to show what was done with the access he provided." Victoria opened a folder. "These are statements from 4 farm families in Holt County who were approached by Midland Horizon within weeks of their data appearing in the shared system. In each case, Midland Horizon's representatives demonstrated knowledge of proprietary financial information that could only have come from Langford's records." She slid the folder across the table. "I have a question," Whitmore said. He looked at Logan. "Mr. Hayes, you're one of these farmers." "Yes, sir." "Tell us what happened." Logan felt the room shift its attention to him. 17 people, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows. He thought about Dale Hutchins' cardboard box of documents. He thought about Carol Hutchins' hands folded on the kitchen table. He thought about Sophie on the tire swing, laughing. "My family has owned our ranch for 3 generations," Logan said. 42 acres in Holt County. We buy our equipment through Langford's distribution network. Have for 20 years. 2 years ago, an investment group called Midland Horizon started making offers on my land. I said no. They came back. I said no again. He paused. My neighbor, Dale Hutchins, wasn't as lucky. He said no 3 times. Then a county inspector showed up with violations nobody had heard of in 40 years. Then his bank started talking about reassessing his loan. By the time Midland Horizon came back with a 4th offer, Dale was so beaten down he couldn't fight anymore. He sold. 4 other families in my county went through the same thing. The room was quiet. "This isn't a business strategy," Logan said. "It's a shakedown. And the information that made it possible, the financial data, the client histories, the knowledge of exactly which farms were vulnerable, came from this company's records." He looked at Garrett Hale. Hale's smile hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted. A calculation, a reassessment. "This is very compelling theater," Hale said. "A struggling rancher, a sympathetic story, but the business before this board is a shareholder vote, not a county fair." He turned to the board. "I've spent 2 years acquiring shares in Langford Industries because I believe this company is underperforming. The current leadership," he glanced at Victoria, "has failed to grow revenue, failed to modernize distribution, and failed to address fundamental structural weaknesses. My proposal is simple. New leadership, new strategy, new direction." "And new land acquisitions," Victoria said, "using Langford's infrastructure as your personal tool." "Langford's infrastructure is an asset," Hale said. "Assets should be maximized." "Maximized for whom? For the farmers who depend on this company, or for your portfolio?" "For the shareholders," Hale said, and smiled. The room divided. Logan could feel it. The split between board members who were disturbed by the evidence and board members who saw Hale's point about revenue. Money had its own gravity. It pulled people toward it regardless of what they believed. Victoria felt it too. He could see it in the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her hands pressed flat against the table. A gesture he'd seen before, on the ranch porch, when she was holding herself together. Gerald Whitmore cleared his throat. "I'd like to call for a 48-hour recess before the vote." The evidence presented today requires review. Seconded, said a woman Logan hadn't been introduced to, a sharp-faced board member named Helen Chen. Hale's attorney objected. The board overruled her. The recess was granted. Outside the conference room, in the hallway with its expensive carpet and recessed lighting, Logan stood with Victoria while her legal team conferred in low voices nearby. "Was it enough?" he asked. "I don't know." She was looking at her phone. Her face was tight. The recess is good. It gives the evidence time to settle. But Hale controls 41%. He only needs 10 more points. The FBI can't go public yet. I talked to them this morning. They need 2 more weeks minimum before they can bring charges. She put her phone away and looked at him. "We might lose, Logan. I need you to understand that." "I understand it. If we lose, if Hale takes the company, I lose everything my father built. And the farms, the ones he's targeting, they lose their main equipment supplier. He'll raise prices, cut service to unprofitable routes, and force more families off their land." She paused. "Including yours. Then we don't lose." "That's not a strategy." "No," he said. "It's a decision." She looked at him. The hallway was empty now except for the two of them. The legal team had moved to a conference room down the hall. Through the window behind her, Omaha spread out under an overcast sky. "When this started," she said slowly, "I thought I knew what I was doing. I had a plan, a contract, a 12-month timeline, everything measured and contained." She paused. "Nothing about this has been contained." "That bother you?" "It terrifies me." She held his gaze. "You terrify me. Not because you're dangerous, because you're good. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly good, in a way I don't encounter in my life. And Sophie," her voice caught, barely, just enough for him to hear. "Sophie terrifies me most of all, because I love her, and I didn't plan to, and I don't know what happens when the contract expires and I'm supposed to walk away from a child who draws pictures of me in front of your house." Logan took a step closer to her, not touching, just closer. "Maybe you don't walk away," he said. "The contract, forget the contract." His voice was low, steady, the same voice he used when he told Sophie everything was going to be okay, and meant it with his whole body. "Forget the timeline. Forget what was supposed to happen. Tell me what you want to happen." She opened her mouth, closed it. Her eyes were bright, and her composure was gone, and she was standing in a hallway on the 32nd floor of her father's building, looking at a rancher from Holt County who had hay under his fingernails and a daughter who drew pictures of her, and for the first time in her life, she didn't have a prepared answer. "I want to stay," she said. The words came out smaller than anything she'd ever said in a boardroom. Smaller, and more honest, and more frightening. Logan nodded, just once. "Okay," he said. "Then stay." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them moved, and neither of them looked away. And the city below them went about its business, indifferent to the fact that 2 people on the 32nd floor had just said the simplest and hardest things they'd ever said to each other, in a hallway, without ceremony, without a contract to define it. Then Victoria's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Her expression changed. "It's Webb," she said. "The FBI just executed warrants on Ashford Strategic Partners." She read further. "They've seized financial records connecting payments to Rennick directly to an account controlled by Garrett Hale's chief of staff." Logan felt something shift. Not relief exactly, but the sensation of weight beginning to move off his shoulders. "It's going to come out," Victoria said. "All of it. The kidnapping, the payments, the connection to Hale." She looked at him. "Before the board votes." "Will it be enough?" Victoria looked at her phone one more time. She looked at the conference room door where 48 hours from now, the future of her father's company would be decided. "Let's find out," she said. The news broke on a Wednesday morning, 41 hours before the board was scheduled to reconvene for the shareholder vote. Logan saw it first. He was in the barn checking on a heifer that had been off her feed when his phone started buzzing with notifications, text messages from neighbors, a call from Dale Hutchins, 3 missed calls from Jerry. He pulled up the news on his phone and stood there in the dim light of the barn, reading, while the heifer watched him with the disinterested gaze of an animal that had no concept of federal indictments. The headline in the Omaha World Herald was straightforward. FBI executes warrants on investment firm linked to Langford Industries takeover bid. The story underneath was less restrained. It detailed the seizure of financial records from Ashford's strategic partners, the arrest of 2 associates connected to Midland Horizon Holdings, and, buried in the 4th paragraph, attributed to sources familiar with the investigation, the allegation that the firm's operations included the kidnapping of a child in Holt County as part of an effort to coerce the withdrawal of corporate leadership. They hadn't named Sophie. They hadn't named Logan. But it didn't take much to connect the dots, and by 9 o'clock the calls from reporters started. Victoria called at 9:15. She was in Omaha at her office, and she sounded like she'd been awake for a very long time. "Have you seen it?" she said. "I've seen it. My communications team is preparing a statement. We're not naming Sophie or you. The FBI has agreed to keep the victim's identity sealed in public filings." A pause. "But the board members will know. They'll put it together." "Good," Logan said. "Let them." "Logan, let them sit in that room tomorrow and vote, knowing what they're voting for, knowing what kind of man Garrett Hale is, knowing what he did to get those shares." His voice was steady, but underneath it was something hot and hard, the compressed fury of a father who had held his terrified daughter in an abandoned building while the man responsible sat in a leather chair on the 32nd floor. "Let them know." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "There's something else," she said. "Garrett's lead attorney, Catherine Price, called my office this morning. She wants to meet, privately." "Why?" "She didn't say, but attorneys don't call when their clients are winning." The meeting happened that afternoon, in a neutral location, a conference room at a law firm in downtown Omaha that neither side was affiliated with. Victoria went alone, over Logan's objection and Webb's stronger objection. She told both of them the same thing. "If she's coming to negotiate, I need to hear what she's offering, and I need to hear it without an audience." Catherine Price was already in the room when Victoria arrived. She looked different from the boardroom, smaller somehow, with the aggressive composure dialed down and something more human showing through the cracks. "Thank you for coming," Price said. "What does he want?" Victoria asked, sitting down across from her. Price folded her hands on the table. "Mr. Hale is prepared to divest his shares in Langford Industries, all of them, effective immediately." Victoria didn't react. She'd spent years learning not to react. "In exchange for what?" she said. "In exchange for your agreement not to pursue civil action against him or his affiliated companies. And for your cooperation in managing the public narrative around the divestment, presenting it as a voluntary strategic decision rather than a forced withdrawal. He wants me to help him save face. He wants to minimize exposure. His exposure includes the kidnapping of a 6-year-old child." Price's expression tightened. "The federal investigation is a separate matter. Mr. Hale's legal team is handling that independently. What I'm discussing today is the corporate situation." "The corporate situation and the kidnapping are not separate," Victoria said. "They're connected by money, personnel, and intent. Your client used the machinery of a corporate takeover to terrorize a family. Those are not parallel issues, they are the same issue." Price was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I have children." Victoria looked at her. "I have 2 daughters," Price said. 8 and 11. I didn't know about the kidnapping until the warrants were executed. I want you to understand that." "I believe you." "I'm advising my client to divest because it's the correct legal strategy. But I'm also advising him to divest because what happened to that child—" She stopped, composed herself. "It shouldn't have happened, and the people responsible should face consequences." Victoria sat with that for a moment. She thought about Logan in the barn. She thought about Sophie on the tire swing. She thought about the concrete floor of the grain elevator, cold against her knees. "Here's what I'll accept," Victoria said. "Full divestment, all shares, all proxy holdings, all affiliated positions, dissolution of Midland Horizon's Nebraska land portfolio. Every farm he acquired through manufactured pressure gets offered back to the original families at the price they were paid, funded by his divestment proceeds. No public narrative management. He doesn't get to pretend this was voluntary. He gets to be quiet and grateful that I'm not adding a civil suit on top of the federal case. Price stared at her. That's significant. So was taking a man's daughter. The silence in the room lasted a long time. Price looked at her hands. She looked at the table. She looked at Victoria. I'll present it to my client, she said. Present it today, Victoria said. The board meets tomorrow. Victoria drove back to the ranch that evening instead of staying in Omaha. She hadn't planned to. The board meeting was at 9 in the morning, which meant she'd need to be on the road by 5:30. But something pulled her west, out of the city, through the farmland, down the county road she was starting to know by feel rather than by GPS. She found Logan and Sophie in the kitchen. Sophie was doing homework at the table, first-grade math, which involved a lot of counting pictures of apples. And Logan was at the stove making what appeared to be some kind of pasta situation that was more ambitious than his usual fare. You're cooking, Victoria said from the doorway. Logan glanced over his shoulder. Don't sound so surprised. I'm not surprised. I'm impressed. Is that garlic? It's an attempt at garlic. He stirred something. How'd the meeting go? She looked at Sophie. Sophie was absorbed in apples. Later, Victoria said. That good, huh? That complicated. Sophie looked up. Victoria, how many is 7 plus 5? 12. I knew that, Sophie said, and wrote it down. Victoria sat at the table and watched Sophie work through her math problems with the fierce concentration of a child who took counting seriously. After a few minutes, without looking up, Sophie said, Are you staying tonight? If that's okay. It's okay, Sophie circled an answer. Your boots are still in the mudroom. I noticed that. Daddy said you might move them, but I told him you wouldn't. Victoria looked at Logan. He had his back to them, but she could see the tips of his ears were red. Your daddy was wrong, Victoria said. Those boots aren't going anywhere. After dinner, after Sophie was in bed, the ritual unchanged, the story, the water, the closet check, Logan and Victoria sat on the porch. It was a clear night. The stars were unreasonable, the way they always were in places where the nearest city light was 60 miles away. Victoria told him about Price's visit, the offer, her counteroffer, the farms. Logan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. You told her to give the farms back, he said finally. I told her to offer them back, at the original purchase price. The families can choose whether to return. With what money? Most of them used the sale proceeds to relocate, pay off debts. Langford Industries will provide bridge financing, 0 interest, flexible terms. She paused. I haven't told the board about this part yet. I'll propose it tomorrow after the vote. Logan looked at her. That's going to cost your company millions. It's going to cost my company money it can afford to lose in service of a mission it was built to fulfill. She looked at the stars. My father started Langford to serve independent farmers. Somewhere along the way, between the growth and the shareholders and the quarterly targets, that got buried under numbers. I'm going to unbury it. The board might not go for it. The board is about to learn that their largest minority shareholder orchestrated the kidnapping of a child. Their appetite for objecting to my proposals is going to be limited. Logan almost smiled. You're ruthless, you know that? I'm practical. There's a difference. She paused. Although in this case, they might look the same. In most cases with you, they look the same. She did smile then, a small one, tired at the edges, but real. Logan, yeah, what I said in the hallway, in Omaha, about wanting to stay. She was looking at her hands. I meant it, but I need you to know what that means. It means I come with a company and a board of directors and shareholders and a public profile that's about to get significantly more visible. It means reporters and scrutiny and a life that doesn't look anything like this. She gestured at the porch, the dark land, the quiet. I can't pretend those things don't exist. I'm not asking you to. I know, but I need you to choose it with your eyes open, not in a moment of crisis or relief or gratitude, not because Sophie loves me or because I helped get her back, because you actually want this, all of it, the mess, the complications, me. He turned to face her. The porch light caught half his face, leaving the other half in shadow. "Victoria," he said, "I've been in love with you since the morning you showed up at 7:45 with coffee and pastries and stood in my yard looking at the sunrise like you'd never seen one before. That was 6 weeks in. I know, I'm slow. You're not slow, you're careful. There's a difference. Now you sound like me. Maybe that's the point." He reached over and took her hand. Just that. No grand gesture, no dramatic declaration, just his rough, scarred hand closing around hers on the armrest of a wooden porch chair, in the dark, on a ranch that was barely holding together, under a sky full of stars that didn't care about shareholder votes or corporate takeovers or the complicated, improbable thing that had grown between two people who had started as a contract and ended up as something neither of them had a word for yet. Victoria held on. She didn't let go. The board meeting the next morning was the shortest in Langford Industries history. Victoria arrived at 8:30. Logan was with her, in the same sport coat, with cleaner hands this time. Webb and his team had cleared the building. Dana had confirmed attendance. All board members present, all shareholder representatives accounted for. Garrett Hale's chair was empty. At 8:55, Catherine Price entered the conference room alone. She carried a single document, which she placed on the table in front of Victoria. "Mr. Hale has accepted your terms," Price said. "Full divestment, effective immediately. The share transfer documents are being processed. The Nebraska land portfolio will be offered back to original sellers at acquisition price, funded by divestment proceeds." She paused. "My client will not be attending today's proceedings." "Noted," Victoria said. Price looked at her for a moment, a look that carried something that might have been respect and might have been something else. Then she turned and left. The room was quiet. Gerald Whitmore, sitting at his usual place near the head of the table, looked at the document. He looked at Victoria. "Well," he said, "I suppose that simplifies things." The vote was unanimous. Victoria retained full control of Langford Industries. The SEC motion was withdrawn. The board appointments that Hale had challenged were confirmed. It took 11 minutes. Afterward, the board members filed out, some stopping to shake Victoria's hand, some stopping to shake Logan's. Helen Chen, the sharp-faced board member who had seconded the recess motion, paused beside Victoria and said quietly, "Your father would have handled this differently." Victoria looked at her. "How?" Louder. Chen almost smiled. "But not better." When the room was empty, Logan and Victoria stood at the window, looking out at Omaha under a bright autumn sky. The city moved below them. Cars, people, the ordinary machinery of a Thursday morning that didn't know or care that the world had shifted slightly on its axis in a conference room on the 32nd floor. "It's done," Victoria said. "It's done." She leaned her forehead against the glass. It was cool. She closed her eyes. "Now what?" Logan asked. She opened her eyes. She looked at him. This man, this rancher, this accidental husband who had walked into her crisis and stayed, not because of the contract or the money or the arrangement, but because somewhere along the way he had decided she was worth staying for. His tie was slightly crooked. There was a callus on his right thumb that she could see from where she stood. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who was out of his element and didn't care, because the person he needed to be near was in this room. "Now," she said, "I make a speech." The speech happened an hour later, in the Langford Industries auditorium, in front of the full company leadership, regional managers, and a handful of press who had been admitted under strict conditions. Logan sat in the front row and watched Victoria take the podium, with the kind of calm that came not from practice, but from certainty. She didn't talk about the takeover. She didn't talk about Garrett Hale, or the investigation, or the vote. She talked about her father. She talked about the company he'd built, and the mission he'd built it on. She talked about the farms she'd visited in Holt County, the families she'd met, the cardboard box of documents that Dale Hutchins had carried into a ranch kitchen on a Tuesday evening. And then she announced the Langford Rural Initiative, a program that would redirect a significant portion of the company's profits towards supporting independent farmers through subsidized equipment, infrastructure grants, and zero-interest financing for operations under 50 acres. The Nebraska land portfolio acquired by Midland Horizon would be offered back to original families. The data-sharing agreements that had enabled the exploitation would be terminated and replaced with privacy protections. My father built this company to serve the people who feed this country, Victoria said. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that. We got distracted by growth metrics and market share, and the comfortable assumption that bigger always means better. It doesn't. Sometimes bigger just means further away from the people who need you. She paused. She looked at Logan in the front row. I was reminded of that by someone who had every reason to distrust me and chose to trust me anyway. Someone who taught me that the measure of a company, like the measure of a person, isn't how much power you accumulate. It's what you do with it when the easy choice and the right choice aren't the same thing. The applause was genuine. Not the polite, obligatory kind that fills corporate auditoriums. The real kind, uneven, surprised, building from the middle of the room outward. Logan didn't clap. He just watched her, standing behind a podium in her father's building in the company she'd fought to keep, saying things that mattered. And he thought about the night she'd appeared on his porch in the rain with mud on her shoes and a proposition that had sounded insane. He thought about how the most important decisions of his life had never been the ones he'd planned. The federal case against Garrett Hale moved forward over the following weeks. Carl Rennick's testimony, combined with the financial records seized from Ashford's strategic partners, built a case that expanded beyond the kidnapping into wire fraud, extortion, and securities violations. Hale's lawyers negotiated, delayed, and filed motions, but the weight of evidence was too heavy. By November, Hale had been indicted on 12 counts. His empire, built on acquisition and leverage and the quiet destruction of things other people had built, began to dismantle itself. Not all at once, but steadily, the way structures fail when the foundation turns out to be rotten. Dale Hutchins got his farm back. He called Logan on a Saturday morning, his voice rough in a way that Logan recognized. The particular roughness of a man trying not to cry. They made the offer, Dale said. Same price I sold for. Langford's financing the whole thing. I heard, Logan said. You taking it? Carol's already packing. Dale paused, a long pause. Tell your wife thank you. Logan smiled. Tell her yourself. She'll be at the ranch this weekend. She's there every weekend? Yeah, Logan said. She is. The Mullers came back too. The Kentons declined. Jim had settled into his life in town and wasn't ready to go back. But he shook Logan's hand at the feed store and said, She did a good thing. Your wife. She did a real good thing. Logan drove home that afternoon and found Victoria and Sophie in the yard. They were doing something that involved a garden hose, a bucket, and a level of enthusiasm that suggested planning had not been a priority. Sophie was soaked. Victoria was soaked. The garden, if that's what the patch of turned earth near the porch was intended to become, was less soaked and more flooded. We're planting, Sophie announced. You're flooding, Logan said. Same thing, Sophie said with the supreme confidence of a 6-year-old. Victoria looked up at him from where she was kneeling in the mud, actual mud, on her knees, with dirt on her face, and her hair coming loose from whatever she'd tied it back with. And she smiled at him with the unself-conscious, unpracticed, slightly ridiculous smile of a woman who had spent her whole life in boardrooms and was currently losing a water fight with a first grader. He loved her so much in that moment that it physically hurt. Jim Kenton says you did a good thing, he told her. I did a practical thing that happened to also be good. Take the compliment, Victoria. Fine. I did a good thing. She wiped mud off her cheek, which mostly just relocated the mud. Happy? Getting there? The contract expired on a Tuesday in late October, 12 months exactly from the day they'd stood on the courthouse steps in O'Neill and let a county clerk named Ruth make it legal. Logan had the document in his filing cabinet. He'd looked at it that morning, the signatures, the terms, the clean clinical language that described a business arrangement between two parties with clearly defined exit conditions. It felt like reading someone else's mail. The people who had signed that contract didn't exist anymore. They'd been replaced by people who cooked pasta together and argued about garden hoses and fell asleep on the couch, watching movies that Sophie picked, and neither of them would have chosen. He hadn't said anything about the expiration date. Neither had Victoria. It sat between them like a piece of furniture neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Not because it was dangerous, but because acknowledging it meant admitting that what they had was still technically temporary, still technically defined by a document that had an end date printed on page 4. Victoria handled it the way Victoria handled everything, by making a plan. She didn't tell Logan about the plan. She told Sophie, which was either a strategic masterstroke or a terrible idea, depending on how you felt about sharing secrets with 6-year-olds. Sophie, for her part, kept the secret for almost 3 full days, which Logan would later describe as a personal record. The community celebration happened on a Saturday afternoon, 2 weeks after the contract expiration date. It was technically a harvest event, the kind of thing that small towns in Nebraska had been doing for generations, with potluck tables and hay bales and kids running in circles for no apparent reason. Victoria had suggested it. Logan had organized it. The guest list included ranchers from 4 counties, a dozen Langford Industries employees who had volunteered for the rural initiative, Dale and Carol Hutchins, Gerald Whitmore, who showed up in a sport coat and cowboy boots that had clearly never been worn before and looked like he was having the time of his life, and approximately half the population of O'Neill. It was held at the Clearwater Ranch. Logan had spent a week getting the place ready. Not fancy, just functional. He'd mowed the field behind the house, set up tables borrowed from the VFW hall, and strung lights between the barn and the old oak tree because Victoria had mentioned once, weeks ago, that she liked the way string lights looked against dark sky, and he'd remembered because he remembered everything she said, even the things she didn't know she'd said out loud. The afternoon was warm for October. People ate and talked, and kids ran around, and for a few hours the ranch felt the way it must have felt when his grandfather was alive. Full, alive, loud, with the sounds of people who belonged to each other. Victoria found Logan near the barn, away from the crowd for a moment, leaning against the wall with a beer and watching Sophie chase Dale Hutchins' granddaughter across the mowed field. "Hey," she said. "Hey, can I borrow you for a minute? I'm not going anywhere." She took his hand and led him toward the center of the yard where the tables were, where the people were. He didn't understand what was happening until she stopped walking and turned to face him, and he saw that Sophie had appeared beside them, materialized the way children do, holding something, a piece of paper, folded once. Victoria took the paper from Sophie. "The contract expired 2 weeks ago," Victoria said. Her voice was clear. Not the corporate voice, not the boardroom voice, but the voice she used on the porch at night, the one that was just hers. People were turning toward them. Conversations were fading. "Technically, we're still married. The divorce paperwork is ready. My lawyers prepared it weeks ago." She held up the folded paper. "This is not the divorce paperwork." She unfolded it. Logan could see it was the contract, the original, with their signatures, with the terms and conditions and the 12-month timeline. "This," Victoria said, "is the arrangement that brought me to this ranch in a storm, wearing the wrong shoes, with a proposition that sounded insane. It defined what we were supposed to be. Business partners, temporary, contained." She looked at him. The yard was quiet now. Everyone was watching. "I don't want a business partner," she said. "I don't want temporary. And nothing about this has been contained since the 2nd week." She tore the contract in half, then in quarters. The pieces fell to the grass between them. "I want a real husband," she said. "I want this ranch, and this kitchen, and this kid who puts frogs in the washing machine. I want 5:30 mornings and bad pasta and fights about garden hoses. I want to keep my boots in your mudroom permanently." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. "I want to stay, not for 12 months, not for a contract, for good." Sophie, standing beside them with the gravity of a child who had been entrusted with a role in something important, looked up at Logan. "She practiced," Sophie whispered loudly. "Like a lot." A laugh moved through the crowd. Victoria closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, she was smiling. The real smile, the rough, unpolished one that had been hiding behind the composed one all along. Logan looked at the torn contract on the grass. He looked at Sophie. He looked at Victoria, mud-stained, tired, impossibly stubborn, inconveniently brilliant, standing in his yard in front of 100 people and asking him for something she could have just taken because she wanted it given freely. "I fell in love with you at 7:45 in the morning," he said, "standing in the yard with coffee and pastries looking at the sunrise like you'd invented it." "You mentioned that." "I'm mentioning it again, because I want everyone here to know that I didn't fall in love with a billionaire. I fell in love with a woman who showed up early and brought coffee and didn't know how to take a compliment. He paused. I still can't believe you tore up a legal document on grass. My lawyers are going to be furious. Your lawyers are always furious. That's true. He stepped forward and kissed her, in the yard, in the light, in front of 100 people and a 6-year-old who squealed and covered her eyes and peeked through her fingers because she was 6, and this was the most interesting thing that had happened since the horse dream. The crowd made noise, Dale Hutchins was clapping, Gerald Whitmore was blowing his nose into a handkerchief. Carol Hutchins had tears running down her face and was pretending she didn't. Sophie uncovered her eyes and threw her arms around both of them, wedging herself between their legs with the absolute certainty of a child claiming her place in a family that had finally, fully become real. They stood there, the three of them, in the yard of a ranch that had been in Logan's family for 3 generations and was about to become something new. Not just a farm, but a foundation, a headquarters, a home for the kind of work that Victoria's father had started, and Victoria was determined to finish. The Clearwater Agricultural Foundation was established the following spring. It operated from a converted bunkhouse on the ranch property, the one nobody had slept in for years, now renovated with new wiring and actual internet service, and a conference table that Victoria had shipped from Omaha and that looked absurdly out of place next to the original log walls. Its mission was simple: provide resources, advocacy, and infrastructure support to independent farming operations across Nebraska and beyond. Its first director was Dale Hutchins, who took the job on the condition that he could still work his own land in the mornings. Victoria split her time between Omaha and the ranch. She stepped back from day-to-day operations at Langford Industries, appointing a CEO she trusted, a woman named Rachel Torres, who had been with the company for 15 years and shared the founder's vision, while retaining her position as board chair. The commute was long. The schedule was complicated. It was, by any objective measure, less efficient than living full-time in Omaha. She did not care about efficiency. She cared about the morning light coming through the kitchen window at 6:30, and the sound of Sophie's footsteps on the stairs, and the creak of the porch chair, and the way Logan looked at her across the kitchen table like she was something he'd found that he hadn't been looking for. She cared about the boots in the mudroom, his scuffed, hers less so, but getting there. She cared about the photograph on the wall, next to the one of Logan's grandparents, a new one, taken by Dale Hutchins at the harvest celebration, showing 3 people standing in front of the ranch house. A tall man, a tall woman, a small girl between them, grinning with a gap where her front tooth used to be. The frame wasn't expensive. It didn't need to be. Logan's ranch survived. More than survived. It grew carefully, the way things grow when they're tended by someone who understands that growth without roots is just falling in a different direction. He paid off the banknote. He repaired the barn roof. He fixed the chicken coop so it didn't lean east anymore. He hired a part-time hand, a young guy from town named Alex, fresh out of the agricultural program at the community college, who reminded Logan of himself at 22, full of energy and short on wisdom and willing to learn both. He still fixed fences in the rain. Some things didn't change. Sophie started 2nd grade. She made a best friend named Lily, who replaced Emma, who was still mean half the days. She learned to ride the old quarter horse that Logan had been keeping in the back pasture, a calm, patient animal named Chester, who tolerated a 7-year-old's enthusiastic incompetence with the dignity of a creature that had seen worse. She drew pictures constantly of the ranch, the horses, the barn, the garden that Victoria had managed to grow into something that actually produced tomatoes. In every picture, there were 3 people. There had always been 3 people, even before she knew who the third one was. On a Tuesday evening in early summer, almost exactly 2 years after a luxury SUV had pulled into his driveway in a storm, Logan came in from the barn and found Victoria at the kitchen table with her laptop. She was on a video call with her board, talking about the quarterly expansion of the rural initiative into 2 new states. Sophie was beside her, drawing, occasionally holding up her artwork for the board members to see. Gerald Whitmore, visible on the screen in a small square, was wearing what appeared to be a fishing hat and was nodding at one of Sophie's drawings with the same serious attention he gave to financial projections. Logan stood in the doorway and watched. This was his life now. This strange, improbable, wonderful thing that had started as a contract in a storm and the wrong pair of shoes. It didn't look like anything he'd imagined. It didn't follow any blueprint. It was messy and complicated and full of compromises that would have looked like failures to anyone who measured life in straight lines. But straight lines were for highways, and he'd always preferred the back roads. Victoria looked up and saw him standing there. She smiled. The real one, always the real one now, and held up one finger. Give me a minute. He waited. He was good at that. She finished the call, closed the laptop, and looked at him. How's the heifer? She asked. Better, she'll be fine. Good. She stood up and stretched. Sophie, 10 more minutes, then homework. I'm drawing homework, Sophie said, which was not true, and they all knew it. Victoria walked over to Logan. She had flour on her sleeve from something. She'd been baking, he realized, badly, which was the only way she baked. But she kept trying because Sophie liked it when the kitchen smelled like cookies, even when the cookies were objectively terrible. You're staring, she said. I'm looking. Same thing. No, he said. Looking is when you see what's there. Staring is when you can't believe what's there. She studied his face. After 2 years, she still sometimes looked at him the way she'd looked at the sunrise that first Saturday morning, like she was seeing something she hadn't known existed. You're getting sentimental in your old age, she said. I'm 34, ancient, says the woman who just spent 20 minutes explaining agricultural subsidies to a board of directors while a 7-year-old showed them drawings of horses. Chester deserves board-level recognition. He's very patient. Logan laughed. She laughed. Sophie looked up from her drawing, saw them laughing, and went back to her work with the satisfied expression of a child who had confirmed that the world was as it should be. Outside, the Nebraska evening was settling in, that long, slow fade from gold to purple that neither of them ever got tired of watching. The ranch spread out under the sky, 42 acres of land that had almost been lost and had been saved by a combination of stubbornness, luck, and the improbable decision of a billionaire to knock on a stranger's door in a rainstorm. There are things you can buy with money: security, comfort, lawyers, helicopters, the ability to trace a phone call in under an hour and deploy a security team across a state. And there are things you cannot buy: the sound of a child saying your name like it belongs to her, the weight of a calloused hand closing around yours on a porch at night, the feeling of coming home to a house that creaks and settles and whistles in the wind through windows that don't quite seal, and knowing that every imperfection is a record of the people who lived there before you and the people who will live there after. Victoria Langford had spent her whole life accumulating the first kind of thing. Logan Hayes had spent his whole life holding on to the second. Together, they discovered what most people spend years figuring out, if they figure it out at all, that the things worth having are the ones you can't put in a contract, the ones that show up uninvited in the wrong shoes at the wrong time and refuse to leave. The lights came on in the kitchen. Sophie's voice drifted out through the window, asking if dinner was going to be the good pasta or the bad pasta. Victoria said there was no bad pasta, and Sophie said there was definitely bad pasta, and Logan said he'd make dinner to avoid the argument, and Victoria said that was probably wise. The porch light flickered down, old wiring on the list, and steadied. The boots stayed in the mudroom. The 3 stick figures stayed on the wall. The ranch held.